Okay, thank you very much, Heidi. That was a very interesting panel. Now we're just turning to a little signature session at the end of this Asia Briefing Live event that we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. Ed and I have a bit of a riff about what people have been saying. We've got the easy jobs, really, I suppose, but we've got a couple of poll questions as well. But anyway, Ed, welcome back. I must say the view of my wall here from my house in Sydney is nothing like the view from the patio at the Bloomberg office there of the Sydney Harbour. So I hope we can get back there soon.
Always good to see a fully stocked library there, Greg. No, certainly working from home has been a challenge, and it hasn't slowed down the incredible pace of news flow that we've had in recent weeks. It really has been quite extraordinary, the volume and magnitude of the news that we've had to cover. And it certainly doesn't seem to have put Asia society off its stride either. In preparing for today's event, I've done a fair bit of reading. I have to say the papers and essays that yourself, Richard Maud, Danny Russell, Wendy have been putting together on this crisis have been extremely helpful and have offered some fascinating insight. But yes, let's hope we can be back in Bloomberg's offices later on this year for an in-person event.
Well, since the poll questions are taking a little while to come, the answers are taking a while to come in, and we're running a little short of time now, I think. So, Ed, we might just jump straight to our first poll question, which is the golden oldie. We've asked this 2 times before, so over to you.
Yeah, so the audience can see that up on screen. So please do vote. We've seen in the past couple of weeks, really, Australia stepping up its response and approach to China. It's proposed a review of what's happened in Wuhan. It's called for a winding back of wildlife wet markets. And we've seen, the expected reaction from Beijing, accusing Canberra of being puppets of the Trump administration. And also that veiled threat of consumer boycott. So it'll be really interesting to see what our audience says this time round. Are we seeing some of those results coming through?
If we don't have them yet, we could have a bit of a talk. Oh, we're getting some results now. Okay, so I can't read them. So okay, so we're seeing there.
I can read those.
Oh yeah, I've got them here now. Actually, yeah, we're seeing that if we're still seeing people mostly think that Australia is handling the China relationship clumsily and inconsistently. Although it is interesting that figure of 50% has dropped back from around the sort of 3/4 level, the 75% level we've seen in the last 2 years. So I would say we're seeing a bit more reserve in the population if our audience here today represents the general population. It has been interesting over the last few years, in the last 5 or 6 years in Australia, that as the attitude towards China, I think amongst the policymakers in Canberra has become a little more sceptical and reserved. The general attitude in the Australian population, measured by the Lowy Institute poll, has been that people have been still quite confident about the relationship with China. Now I think you're seeing in the opinion polls, the Lowy poll last year and now our poll today, a slight pulling back of confidence in China. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that's interesting how that's reflected, and that was borne out in some of the other polling that we saw as well. The piece about whether or not we should push back or accept China's growing influence in the region. The poll today said 53% saying that we should accept. Now that's down markedly from the 90% in 2018 and the 73% just last year. So yeah, definitely shifting perceptions of that core trading relationship.
Okay, now perhaps we should just go to our 5th poll, since we're running down on time, and then we can go back to the panel a little bit. So now the 5th poll is looking a bit beyond, even bigger picture than China, if that's possible, to the whole state of the global diplomatic order, diplomatic architectural order. after COVID-19. This is a big issue for middle power sized countries like Australia. So the question is, how do you think COVID-19 crisis will reshape the global order? Will it revive the nation state with every country basically looking after itself, or will we see a shift back to greater global cooperation with stronger multilateral institutions? Or will we see a sort of middle path of which some of our panelists today talked a little bit about, of stronger regional groupings, or Wendy Cutler talked about this earlier, I guess, particularly built around middle powers like Australia. That's something that's quite of interest to Australian government policymakers. Or finally, more harshly, will nothing in fact change? Okay, so we're seeing we're seeing a very mixed result, you'd have to say here, although it's very interesting for our policymakers in Australia that half our audience see quite a useful role for regional groupings. Australia's been quite active in developing regional groupings in Asia, and has tried to do a lot of work in this area in the past, and would be quite interested in doing more. So I guess you'd have to say that's quite an optimistic outcome. It is interesting, though, that when you get to the binary question of every nation for themselves or just greater conventional multilateral cooperation, we're seeing the sort of the harsher view of the world dominate there, with 24% of people thinking it's every country for themselves. So it's a difficult territory for national foreign policy makers to navigate, I would say, although there's a touch of optimism for a country like Australia that is quite good at working in regional institutions.
Yeah, it is interesting, that result, Greg. You know, the past few years we have seen globalization suffering blows or coming under assault. We've had the European debt crisis, we've had Brexit, the trade war, with populism fostering more of a nationalist sentiment. And we're also potentially facing a long and deep global recession that could further strengthen that nationalist sentiment. So, you know, I find it reassuring that we're seeing the response, the A response, only at about 25%, and people are seeing opportunities for more regional groupings. Maybe not the wholesale multilateral approach, but that is reassuring.
Yes. Well, maybe, Ed, we should just quickly reflect in the couple of minutes we have left on the panel discussion. I found it very interesting that we had quite a sophisticated discussion there about this whole question of domestic economic sovereignty or resilience. Prime Minister Morrison sort of popped this on the national agenda just a couple of days before Easter. It was quite interesting timing. I don't know whether he expected people in Australia over Easter to really think about this topic very much, but anyway, it's certainly become a talking point since then. I think I sort of detect that ministers have embraced it, but when you hear them talking about it, it doesn't seem clear that there is a simple pathway ahead. There's quite a lot of ways to achieve this, and I think our panelists today sort of really drew that out by resisting the idea that we really have to wind back our international engagement as a country that depends on foreign capital and foreign investment. But at the same time, Belinda sort of raised the whole issue of our fundamentals, our basic skill sets, which these are very important in developing. So I think there's a spectrum of ways to achieve domestic economic sovereignty, from raising tariffs, from government investment in companies, all those things we had in the poll question. It seemed that our audience wants to do all of them. I don't think that gives the government much clarity, and I think perhaps the more subtle views we heard from our panelists today might be of more use to the government.
Yeah, Greg, I think the main takeaway from me was the sense of optimism that I picked up strongly from both John and Mark. This optimism that's largely down to Australia's proximity to China and the rest of Asia. John said that's our big chance Mark rejected any call for us to be pulling away from China, from diminishing our trading relationship. We should be doubling down on that. But he also quite interestingly pointed to other opportunities in the region. He singled out Indonesia, Korea, Japan, and of course, those countries are central to the government's own strategy of diversifying trade. Again, Australia could stand to benefit from its geographic position in the region. And with that, I'm afraid we are out of time. But before we sign off, I'd like to hand back over to CEO of Asia Society Australia, Philip Ivanov, for a final word on today's event.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks to all our speakers, and thanks to all 450 of you, I was told, for joining us today from right across the globe. One of many things that this pandemic has shown us is how interconnected our world is and how interlinked Australia is with Asia. And we strongly believe that the health of our region, whether it's public health, economic, social, or geopolitical, will be critical to Australia's recovery. That's why we feel Asia Society's mission of informing our leaders, our community about Asia and connecting them with Asia is more relevant than ever. So with physical presence now in two of Australia's largest cities in Melbourne and Sydney and growing online reach, we invite you to join our community and keep this important conversation going. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to catching you online or in person very soon. Have a great day ahead.